Okay, we are reading the Celestine Prophecy by James Redfield. We are in the chapters The Struggle for Power, page 107 of the book, and page 60 of the 61 and 58 of the PDF.
Actually, the book from where I was also reading had a different page than yours.
That's all right.
Even my book has a different.
Yeah,
My book
so
is.
announcing the page numbers, I think, are all mixed up.
Shimangla,
No,
please.
I don't think I understand. Bill looked thoughtful. All this is still unconscious in most people. All we know is that we feel weak, and when we control others, we feel better. What we don't realize is that this sense of feeling better costs the other person. It is their energy that we have stolen. Most people go through their lives in a constant hunt for someone else's energy.
So what
He
is
looked
happening
at
here? What is happening here is that when we absorb energy from another person, definitely we get energized. But what is the result? The other person is getting depleted. So there is a depletion in the energy field of the other person, and we are feeling energized. So it's not a win-win situation. It's a win-lose situation. Okay. And because we feel better by grabbing that energy, if you are in this control drama business, or the struggle for power, then you're constantly going to be looking out for people who you can absorb power from. So this will develop into a pattern in your life, and you will constantly go into that particular syndrome over and over and over again.
he looked at me with a twinkle in his eye. Although occasionally it works differently. We meet someone who at least for a little while will voluntarily send us their energy.
Now, this is important here. Now, at times, if you care for someone, you're sending energy to that particular person out of love, out of care, out of concern, or just for the feeling of doing good. Okay. Now, when we are in the healing group, when we are sending reballs to another person, what are we doing? We are not asking for anything back from them. We are generously volunteering our intent, connecting with the universal field to send them energy. Okay. So we are voluntarily sending them that love energy. So it is a win-win situation. It is not a win-lose situation. Because when we do that, we also get energized because we are willingly giving that energy to them, because we are connecting with the universal source of energy.
What are you getting at? Think back to when you and Marjorie were eating together at the restaurant in town and I walked in. Okay. I don't know what you two were talking about, but obviously her energy was pouring into you. When I walked in, I could see it clearly. Tell me, how did you feel during that time? I felt good, I said. In fact, the experiences and concepts I was relating seemed crystal clear to me. I could express myself easily. But what does that mean? He smiled. Occasionally, another person will voluntarily want us to define their situation for them, giving us their energy outright, the way Marjorie did with you. It
Just one
makes us
second.
feel empowered.
Okay, so now what is happening over here? Whenever someone else is voluntarily giving us energy, we get energized and automatically our thinking becomes better. There's more clarity in our thinking. So the same thing is happening when we are putting a reball on ourselves, because we are connecting with the universal energy. When we are going into F10 or F12, the same thing will start happening. The clarity of thought, the clarity of vision will automatically start to come into the field.
So if I give my energy voluntarily, will I
Yeah.
become weak?
No, you will not, because it depends on the way that you're doing it, Auntie. Are you giving your personal energy, or are you connecting with a universal source and then sending that energy? Now, today, a mother is giving love to her child. Do you think the mother gets weakened by giving love to her child? The point is
No.
that what state of consciousness are you giving that energy from? That becomes the most important factor and the key over here. Where what is the state? Are you on the left side of the grid or the right side of the grid? That will make a huge difference in the way whether you're depleted or whether you're getting energized while you're giving the energy. So over here, he clearly says that over here, I don't know what you were talking about, but obviously her energy was pouring into you. When I walked in, I could clearly see it. Tell me, how did you feel during this time? Now, when the first time that the hero encountered Marjorie, he was sending out, that he was attracted to her kind of energy, and
Yeah.
Marjorie stepped back. Now, both of them understand the game, and when he was explaining something to Marjorie or telling a story to Marjorie, at that point in time, Marjorie was sending him love. So he was not grabbing the energy, it was being voluntarily sent to him.
He smiled. Occasionally, another person will voluntarily want us to define the situation for them, giving us their energy outright the way Marjorie did with you. It makes us feel empowered. But you'll see that this gift doesn't usually last. Most people, Marjorie included, aren't strong enough to keep giving energy. That's why most relationships eventually turn into power struggles.
This is important
Humans
now over
link up
here.
energy and then
Just one
fight
second.
over.
This is important over here. Now, so when this energy comes to us, we naturally feel empowered. But if the person is giving this energy through their personal power, then as Asha Auntie just said, that if I keep giving power, then will I get drained? So it's like if you have a bucket and your energy is full of the water in the bucket is your energy. Now, if there's a leak in the energy or leak in the bucket, then all your energy is going to flow out. So unless you are replenishing it from somewhere, if you keep giving energy, you're going to get depleted. That's why connecting with a higher source of consciousness becomes extremely important. And then he says that ultimately, if a person is constantly giving energy from themselves and not replenishing it in a particular way, then what is going to happen is that person is going to get depleted, and then they're going to go out to look for retrieving that energy back. Okay, so then it becomes a power struggle of energy. And that is why most couples, ultimately, in the beginning, it's all right. And then they start having problems and issues later on because they're attempting to grab energy from each other. They're not allowing freedom in the relationship to each other. That is where the power struggle starts to come. You have to do this for me. You have to be like this. You have to do this. All those things start happening. And then it creates a problem unnecessarily.
Humans link up energy and then fight over who is going to control it. And the loser always pays the price.
So again, it's a
He
win
stopped
lose.
abruptly.
It's a win lose situation. It is not a win win situation which develops.
पहले आगे कर दाओ आगे करवा लो यहाँ तक हाँ ये ना उधर माल से उधर
Pramila
कर
ji,
दो
please mute
ये सब
yourself.
माल जितना जाता है जान
Okay, go ahead.
He stopped abruptly and looked at me. Do you get the fourth insight? Think about what has happened to you. You observed that energy flows between people and wondered what it meant. And then we ran into Renu, who told you that psychologists were already searching for some reason humans sought to control each other.
So again,
All that
what is he doing now? He's just attempting to bring to the hero's notice what are the coincidences which have been happening around him.
all that was demonstrated with the Peruvian family. You saw clearly that dominating another makes the dominator feel powerful and knowledgeable, but it sucks the vital energy out of those who are being dominated. It makes no difference if we tell ourselves that we are doing it for the person's own good or that they are our children and therefore we should be in control all the time. The damage still occurs.
So whenever there is a control drama playing out where one person is attempting to grab energy from the other person, Maybe you are thinking I'm doing it for the good of that person, but if the freedom is not there, okay, and we are forcing the other person to give energy to us, it will always land up creating a problem. And then it becomes ingrained genetically also. So that becomes a big problem, because what happens to a person when they are growing up, they will do the same thing to their children also. So generation after generation, the thing starts to perpetuate.
Next, you ran into Jensen and got a taste of what this actually feels like. You saw that when someone is dominating you psychically, they actually take your mind away.
So
It
now
was
this is
not
also
as if
important. This is important here. When someone is dominating you psychically, okay, so they are getting and grabbing energy from you in the psychic sense, then it automatically will put fog. Many times, ये जो नजर लग जाता है, we talk about नजर लग गया. What is it? There is a psychic attack on you. So either a person is sending some not required energy into your field, or they are sucking the energy out of your field. So you get mental block, like the mind just goes blocked. There's mental fogging which starts to take place.
you saw that when someone is dominating you psychically, they actually take your mind away. It was not as if you lost some intellectual debate with Jensen. You didn't have the energy or mental clarity to debate with. All your mental power was going to Jensen. Unfortunately, this kind of psychic violence happens all the time throughout human culture, often by otherwise well meaning people.
So what happens
I
here?
just
When Shimangla, just when a psychic attack takes place, and we actually have aura pictures showing these psychic attacks. Some of you have seen them. You can actually see it in the aura picture, where there is a cut, there's a slash, or the energy is just getting sucked out of a person. It Unfortunately, it can happen by well-meaning people also. Okay, they don't mean to do it, and this happens a lot with parents and children. When children are troubling their parents, the parents will curse the children and say that when you have children, you see they will do the same thing to you. And what is it? Now it's being perpetuated. So you're sending an energy, you're sending an intent that your child is going to experience the low that you are experiencing. So watching our words with how we are communicating, and especially to our children, it becomes extremely important.
I just nodded. Will had summarized my experience exactly. Try to integrate the fourth insight fully. Will continued. See how it fits together with what you already know. The third insight showed you that the physical world is actually a vast system of energy. And now, the fourth points out that for a long time, we humans have been unconsciously competing for the only part of this energy we have been open to, the part that flows between people. This is what human conflict has always been about, at every level, from all the petty conflict in families and employment settings to wars between nations. It's the result of feeling insecure and weak and having to steal someone else's energy to feel okay.
So now what is happening? All the conflicts in the world today are basically caused because of this feeling of weakness, restlessness, and the desire to control the other person. It's not a win-win. It's a constant win-lose situation that we are perpetuating.
Wait a minute, I protested. Some wars had to be fought. They were right. Of course, Will replied. But the only reason that any conflict can't be immediately settled is that one side is holding on to an irrational position for energy purposes.
So now what does this mean
Will
over
appeared
here?
to
So what does this mean and imply over here? That someone is taking a rigid position because they want to control the energy. That is the basic game where all conflicts start from.
Bill appeared to remember something. Reaching into a satchel, he pulled out a bundle of papers clipped together. I almost forgot, he said. I found a copy of The Fourth Insight. He handed me the copy and said nothing else, looking straight ahead as we drove.
Okay,
I
one
picked
second.
up the small.
Now continue.
Just a second. I picked up the small flashlight Will kept on the floorboard and for the next 20 minutes read the short document. Understanding the fourth insight, it said, is a matter of seeing the human world as a vast competition for energy and thus for power. Yet, once humans understand their struggle, the insight continued, we would immediately begin to transcend this conflict. We would begin to break free from the competition over mere human energy, because we would finally be able to receive our energy from another source.
So what does this mean?
I looked at
We are constantly attempting to grab energy from the other person. The moment we realize that we can get energy from the universal consciousness and the universal source, our attempt to grab energy from the other person will drop. Okay. And then once that drops, that is when the power actually comes into our system.
Yet, I looked at Will. What's the other source? I asked. He smiled but said nothing.
So again, that is an unfolding which is going to take place over a period of time.
The message of the mystics. The next morning, I awoke as soon as I heard Will stirring. We had spent the night at a house belonging to one of his friends, and Will was sitting up in a cot across the room. Dressing quickly, it was still dark outside. Let's get packed, he whispered. We gathered our clothes and made several trips out to the jeep with some extra supplies Will had bought. The center of town was only a few hundred yards away, but few lights penetrated the darkness. Dawn was but a streak of lighter sky towards the east. Other than a few birds signaling the impending morning, there were no sounds. When we finished, I stayed with the jeep while Will spoke briefly with his friend, who stood sleepily on the porch while we completed our packing. Suddenly, we heard noise at the crossroads. We could see the lights of 3 trucks as they drove into the center of the town and stopped. That could be Jensen, Will said. Let's walk over there and see what they're doing, but carefully. We made our way across several streets and into an alley that entered the main road about 100 feet from the trucks. 2 of the vehicles were being filled with fuel and the other was parked in front of the store. 4 or 5 people stood nearby. I saw Marjorie walk out of the store and place something in the truck there, then walk casually towards us, gazing into the adjacent shops. Walk over there and see if you can get her to come with us, Will whispered. I'll wait for you here.
So now what has
I
happened?
slipped.
Marjorie is totally got stuck with that Jensen fellow.
I slipped round the corner, and as I walked towards her, I was horrified. Behind her, in front of the store, I noticed for the first time that several of Jensen's men carried automatic weapons. A few moments later, my fright intensified. In the street across from me, armed soldiers crouched low and slowly approached Jensen's group.
So
At the exact time Marjorie saw me.
what was happening now? So the government was actually going after Jensen's men.
At the exact time Marjorie saw me, Jensen's men saw the others and scattered. A burst of machine gun fire filled the air. Marjorie looked at me with terror in her eyes. I rushed forward and grabbed her. We ducked into the next alley. More shots were being fired amid angry shouting in Spanish. We tripped over a pile of empty cartons and fell, our faces almost touching. Let's go, I said, jumping to my feet. She struggled up, then pulled me down again, nodding ahead to the end of the alley. Two men with weapons were hiding with their backs to us, looking down the next street. We froze. Finally, the men raced across the street to the wooded area beyond. I knew we had to get back to the house of Wilson's friend to the jeep. I was sure Will would go there. We crept carefully to the next street. Angry shouting and gunfire could be heard towards the right, but we could see no one. I looked left. Nothing there, either no sign of Will. I figured he had run ahead of us. Let's run across to the woods, I said to Marjorie, who was now alert and looking determined. Then I continued. We'll stay along the edge of the woods and bear left. The jeep is parked in that direction. Okay, she said. We crossed the street quickly and made our way to within 100 feet or so of the house. The jeep was still there, but we could see no movement anywhere. As we prepared to dash across the last street to the house, a military vehicle turned a corner to our left and proceeded slowly towards the dwelling. Simultaneously, Will ran across the yard, started the jeep, and sped away in the opposite direction. The vehicle pursued. Damn, I said. What'll we do now? Marjorie asked, panic returning to her face. More shots were being fired in the streets behind us, closer this time. Ahead, the forest thickened and inclined up the ridge, which towered over the town and ran north and south. It was the same ridge that I had seen from the overlook earlier. Let's get to the top, I said. Hurry. We climbed several hundred yards up the ridge. At an overlook, we stopped and looked back towards the town. Military vehicles seemed to be pouring into the crossroads, and numerous soldiers were conducting what seemed to be a house-to-house search. Below us, at the base of the ridge, I could hear muffled voices. We rushed further up the mountain. All we could do now was run. We followed the ridge north all morning, stopping only to crouch down when a vehicle traveled along the ridge parallel to us on our left. Most of the traffic was the same steel grey military jeep we had seen before, but occasionally a civilian vehicle would pass. Ironically, the road provided a lone landmark and point of security against the wilderness all around us. Ahead, the two ridges grew closer together and more steeply sloped. Jagged outcroppings of rock protected the valley floor between. Suddenly, from the north, we saw a jeep like Will's approach, then turn quickly onto a side road which looped down into the valley. That looks like Will, I said, straining to see. Let's get down there, Marjorie said. Wait a minute. What if it's a trap? What if they've captured him and are using the jeep to lure us out? Her face fell. You stay here, I said. I'll go down there and you watch me. If everything's okay, then I'll motion for you to follow. Reluctantly, she agreed, and I started down the steep mountain towards the spot where the jeep had parked. Through the foliage, I could vaguely see someone get out of the vehicle, but couldn't see who it was. Holding onto small bushes and trees, I worked my way between the outcroppings, occasionally sliding down in the thick hummus. Finally, the vehicle was directly across from me on the opposite slope, perhaps 100 yards away. The driver, leaning against a rear fender, was still obscured. I moved to my right to get a better look. It was Will. I rushed further to my right and felt myself slide. At the last minute, I reached for a tree trunk and pulled myself back up. My stomach twisted with fright. Below me was a sheer drop of 30 feet or more. I had barely avoided killing myself. Still holding the tree, I stood up and tried to gain Will's attention. He was surveying the ridge above my head, and then his eyes dropped and he looked right at me. He jerked up and walked towards me in the bushes. I pointed down to the steep gorge. He surveyed the valley floor, then called to me. I don't see a way across, he said. You'll have to move down the valley and cross there. I nodded and was about to signal Marjorie when I heard a vehicle approaching in the distance. Will jumped into his jeep and sped back towards the main road. I hurried up the hill. I could see Marjorie through the foliage walking towards me. Suddenly, from the area behind her, came loud shouts in Spanish and the sounds of people running. Marjorie hid below a rock overhang. I changed directions, running as quickly as I could to the left. As I ran, I searched for a view of Marjorie through the trees. Just as I caught sight of her, she screamed loudly as two soldiers grabbed her arms and forced her to stand. I continued to run up the slope, keeping low, a look of panic frozen in my mind. Once at the top of the ridge, I headed north again, my heart pounding with terror and panic. After running more than a mile, I stopped and listened. I could hear no movement or talking behind me. Lying flat on my back, I tried to relax and think clearly, but the awful spectre of Marjorie's capture was overwhelming. Why did I ask her to remain on the ridge alone? What should I do now? I sat up and took a breath and gazed over the road on the other ridge. I had seen no traffic while I was running. Again, I listened intently. Nothing except the usual forest sounds. Slowly, I began to calm down. After all, Marjorie had only been captured. She was guilty of nothing except running from gunfire. Probably she would be detained only until her identity as a legitimate scientist could be established. Once more, I headed north, my back aching slightly. I felt dirty and tired, and pangs of hunger erupted in my stomach. For 2 hours, I walked without thinking and without seeing anyone. Then, from the slope to my right, I heard sounds of running. I froze and listened again, but the sounds had stopped. Here the trees were larger, shielding the ground below from the sun, thinning the underbush. I could see 50 or 60 yards. Nothing moved. I walked past a large boulder on my right and several trees, stepping as softly as possible. 3 other massive outcroppings lay along my path, and I moved past 2 of them. Still no movement. I walked around the third boulder. Twigs cracked behind me. I turned around slowly. There, next to the rock, was the bearded man I had seen at Jensen's farm, his eyes wild, panicked, his arm shaking as he pointed an automatic weapon at my stomach. He seemed to be struggling to remember me. Wait a minute, I stammered. I know Jensen. He looked at me more closely and lowered the weapon. Then, from the woods behind us, we heard the sounds of someone moving. The bearded man ran past me towards the north, holding the rifle in one hand. Instinctively, I followed. Both of us were running as fast as we could, dodging limbs and rocks and occasionally glancing back. After several hundred yards, he stumbled and I raced past him. I collapsed between two rocks to rest and to look back, trying to detect movement. I saw a lone soldier 50 yards away raise his rifle towards the huge man who was struggling to his feet. Before I could utter a warning, the soldier fired. The man's chest exploded as bullets tore through it from the rear, splattering me with blood. An echo of rifle fire filled the air. For an instant he stood motionless, his eyes glazed, then his body arched forward and fell. I reacted blindly, running north again, away from the soldier, keeping the trees between me and the area from which the bullets had come. The ridge grew constantly more rugged and rocky and began to incline dramatically upwards. My entire body shook with exhaustion and terror as I struggled up the spaces between the outcroppings. At one point, I slipped and dared a glance backwards. The soldier was approaching the body. I slithered around a rock just as the soldier looked up, seemingly right at me. I stayed low to the ground and crawled past several other boulders. Then the slope of the ridge leveled off, blocking the soldier's view, so I jumped to my feet again, running as fast as I could between the rocks and trees. My mind was numb. Escape was all I could think of, though I didn't dare look back. I was sure I heard the soldier running behind.
So over here he says, my mind was numb. Okay. What does this mean? Whenever we are in a flight and fight response, cortical function starts getting inhibited and just survival starts to take over. That is the time when you can also have mind fog and not think clearly. Okay, this is something that happened to Karan also. His mind became blank when he was stuck. His chariot got stuck, his mind got blank. So he did not remember all the training that he had. So that's when the flight and fight is activated, the stress response is activated. It really inhibits the way that we think. Okay, so he says my mind was numb.
The ridge inclined ahead and I fought my way up, my strength beginning to wane. At the top of the rise, the ground leveled out and was thick with tall trees and lush undergrowth. Rising behind them was a sheer rock face that I had to scale delicately, searching for hand and footholds as I proceeded. I struggled to the top and my heart fell at the sight before me. A drop off of 100 feet or more blocked my way. I could go no further. I was doomed, finished. Rocks slid along the outcropping behind me, indicating the soldier was closing fast. I sank to my knees. I was exhausted, spent, and with a final sigh, I released the last of my fight, accepting my fate. Soon I knew the bullets would come, and interestingly, as an end to the terror, death seemed almost a welcome relief. As I waited, my mind flashed to childhood Sundays and to the innocent contemplation of God. Would it be like? Death? I tried to open myself to the experience.
Okay, so
After a
again,
long period
what he says over here, as soon as I knew the bullets would come, and interestingly, as the end to the terror, death seemed an almost welcome relief. So, when you are very troubled and you don't know how to handle it, this is what leads to suicide also. That you get so stuck and you don't have any means, no resources to be able to actually deal with the struggle. That is when you contemplate committing suicide. But then he shifted. Okay, then see, when he was in terror, he was on the left side of the grid, and then he says my mind flashed to the childhood Sundays and to the innocent contemplation of God. So where did he shift? He shifted to the right side. He called on an inner resource of a memory of something which uplifted him, and that immediately shifted his state, that okay, now I am willing to experience the experience of death, and I opened myself to the experience. So Joe McMonaghan has a story where when he got his heart attack, he was in a restaurant and he walked out of the door and he got a heart attack and he fell and he realized he had an heart attack. Now he said that I wanted to experience the experience of dying or this process which was happening. So he totally relaxed himself, because if you're stressed out, you're not going to be able to experience. So he relaxed himself and he actually survived that fatal heart attack because he totally relaxed himself. So in the same way, if I can shift into the right side of the grid, relax myself and treat it as uplifting, it's a matter of shifting your perspective about anything. Automatically, that can become an opportunity rather than a threat.
After a long period of waiting during which I had no concept of time, I suddenly became aware that nothing had happened. I looked around and noticed for the first time that I was positioned on the highest peak of the mountain. Other ridges and cliffs fell away from this point, leaving me with a panoramic view in all directions. A movement caught my eye. There, far down the slope towards the south, walking casually away from me, was the soldier, the gun belonging to Jensen's man slung across one arm. The sight warmed my body and filled me with ripples of silent laughter. I had somehow survived. I turned and sat cross legged and savored the euphoria. I wanted to stay here forever. The day was brilliant with sunshine and blue sky. As I sat there, I was struck by the closeness of the purple hills in the distance, or rather, the feeling that they were close. The same perception applied to the new few puffs of white cloud drifting overhead. I felt as if I could reach out and touch them with my hand.
So now what was happening over here? I don't know why this echo is coming. Shivanga, reduce the volume of your speaker.
I have to put it at half.
No, no, reduce the volume from outside also. So he is going over here when he's describing this, he is actually going into an altered state of consciousness. And when we go into an altered state, time and distance starts to evaporate. So time and space totally shift the way that we perceive them. Okay, so this is what he's saying, that the hills which were at a distance felt close, the clouds felt as if I could touch them. So he's in an altered state of consciousness here.
As I reached up towards the sky, I noticed something different about the way my body felt. My arm had glided upward with incredible ease, and I was holding my back, neck, and head perfectly straight with absolutely no effort. From my position, sitting cross legged, I stood up without using my arms and stretched. The feeling was one of total lightness.
So this is a perfect
Looking
example.
at the
This is a perfect example of being in an altered state. Okay, so he makes some statements here. There was something different in the way my body felt. My arm glided with incredible ease. I was holding my body absolutely perfectly erect. Okay. I stood up without using my arms and stretched. The feeling was one of total lightness. So when we are going into F10 state also, this is literally a perfect description of what happens when you start operating in F10.
Looking at the distant mountains, I noticed that a daytime moon had been out and was about to set. It looked to be about a quarter full and hung over the horizon like an inverted bowl. Instantly, I understood why it had that shape. The sun, millions of miles directly above me, was shining only on the top of the sinking moon. I could perceive the exact line between the sun and the lunar surface, and this recognition somehow extended my consciousness outward even further. I could imagine the moon having already dipped below the horizon and the exact reflected shape it would present to those who lived further west and could still see it. Then I imagined how it would look when it moved directly under me on the other side of the planet. To the people there, it would appear full because the sun over my head would shine past the earth and strike the moon squarely. This picture sent a rush of sensation up my spine, and my back seemed to straighten even more as I conceived, no, I experienced the same amount of space commonly felt over my head as also existing under my feet on the other side of the globe. For the first time in my life, I knew the earth's roundness, not as an intellectual concept, but as an actual sensation.
So again, what is
At
happening?
one level,
He's going into an altered state, right? So he experienced the same amount of space commonly felt over my head as also existing under my feet on the other side of the globe. So we have the Earth star and Sun star technically. So you actually can feel that energy field below your feet as well as above your head. And
at one level, this
another
awareness
thing he
excited
makes over
me,
here,
but
another thing he says over here, I okay, sensation rushed up my spine and I seemed to straighten even more. I conceived. No, I experienced. So when you're conceiving something, you're imagining it. But if you're experiencing it, it becomes a totally different ball game. So we are constantly talking about it. Conceiving is based on knowledge. Experience is based on the actual experience. When you have both, it becomes wisdom. Okay, so he actually experienced it, and then it became real for him.
at one level, this awareness excited me, but at another, it seemed perfectly ordinary and natural. All I wanted to do was immerse myself in the feeling of being suspended, floating amid a space that existed in all directions. Rather than having to push myself away from the earth with my legs, as I stood there, resisting the earth's gravity, I now felt as though I was held up by some inner buoyancy, as though I was filled like a balloon with just enough helium to hover over the ground and barely touch it with my feet. It was similar to being in perfect athletic condition, as after a year of intense exercise, only far more coordinated and light.
So now what happened? I immersed myself in the feeling of being suspended, floating amid a space that existed in all directions. So, again, when we are going into altered states, we kind of disconnect from the body. Our attention is reduced to focus on the body and it goes elsewhere, right? So, we feel that feeling of buoyancy and that floaty feeling. Anyone who has done the excursion workshop can vouch for this, that they feel exactly this floaty feeling over here, and as if like a balloon is floating. Now he says it was very similar to being in a perfect athletic condition as a year of intense exercise. So this is what is called the zone. When an athlete goes into the zone, everything around him just starts happening, or her, it just starts happening. They're not putting any effort into it, so it just automatically rolls out. That is what he's feeling over here. So the F10 state is very similar to the zone state that many athletes experience when they are achieving peak performance.
I sat down again on the rock, and again everything seemed close. The rugged outcrop on which I was sitting, the tall trees further down the slope, and the other mountains on the horizon. And as I watched the limbs of the trees sway gently in the breeze, I experienced not just a visual perception of the event, but a physical sensation as well, as if the limbs moving in the wind were hairs on my body.
So again, this is again describing a perfect altered state of consciousness.
I perceived everything to be somehow part of me. As I sat on the peak of the mountain looking out at the landscape falling away from me in all directions, I felt exactly as if what I had always known as my physical body was only the head of a much larger body consisting of everything else I could see. I experienced the entire universe looking out on itself through my eyes.
So again, we are more than our physical body. This is what he was experiencing.
This perception induced a flash of memory. My mind raced backwards in time, past the beginning of my trip to Peru, past my childhood and my birth. The realization was present that my life did not, in fact, begin with my conception and birth on this planet. It began much earlier with the formation of the rest of me, my real body, the universe itself.
So again, when we go into these altered states of consciousness, then what happens is that time again loses its relevance. So the past and the future is immediately accessible. And past, by past, I mean even your past life, because nothing is hidden. And you can even access your future life. So what he's saying over here, as if I experienced my childhood again.
The science of evolution had always bored me, but now, as my mind continued to race backwards in time, all the things I had read on the subject began to come back to me, including conversations with a friend who resembled Reno. I recalled that this was the field he was interested in, evolution. All knowledge seemed to merge with actual memories. Somehow I was recalling what had happened, and the recollection allowed me to look at evolution in a new way. I watched as the first matter exploded into the universe, and I realized, as the third insight had described, that there was nothing truly solid about it. Matter was only energy vibrating at a certain level, and in the beginning, matter existed only in its simple vibratory form, the element we called hydrogen. That's all there was in the universe, just hydrogen.
So everything builds up from something, okay? So over a period of time, the matter is made out of molecules. Molecules are made out of atoms. So the hydrogen atom is the simplest atom, okay? Now everything builds up from hydrogen.
I observed the hydrogen atoms begin to gravitate together as if the ruling principle, the urge, of this energy was to begin a movement into a more complex state. And when pockets of this hydrogen reached a sufficient density, it began to heat up and to burn and to become what we call a star. And in this burning, the hydrogen fused together and leaped into the next higher vibration, the element we call helium. As I continued to watch, these first stars aged and finally blew themselves up and spewed the remaining hydrogen and the newly created helium out into the universe. And the whole process began again. The hydrogen and helium gravitated together until the temperature became hot enough for new stars to form, and that in turn fused the helium together, creating the element lithium, which vibrated at the next higher level.
So what are they saying? That two hydrogen fuse to create helium, then two helium merge to become lithium. So as we go ahead, the progression of nature and the more complexity in the nature will start to manifest.
And so on. Each successive generation of stars creating matter that had not existed before, until the wide spectrum of matter, the basic chemical elements, had been formed and scattered everywhere. Matter had evolved from the element hydrogen, the simplest vibration of energy, to carbon, which vibrated at an extremely high rate. The stage was now set for the next step in evolution. As far sorry, as our sun formed, pockets of matter fell into orbit around it, and one of them, the Earth, contained all the newly created elements, including carbon. As the earth cooled, gases once caught in the molten mass migrated to the surface and merged together, forming water vapor, and the great rains came, forming oceans on the then barren crust. Then, when water covered much of the earth's surface, the skies cleared and the sun, burning brightly, bathed the new world with light and heat and radiation. And in the shallow pools and basins, amid the great lightning storms that periodically swept the planet, matter leaped past the vibratory level of carbon to an even more complex state, to the vibration represented by the amino acids. But for the first time, this new level of vibration was not stable in and of itself. Matter had to continually absorb other matter into itself in order to sustain its vibration. It had to eat. Life, the new thrust of evolution, had emerged. Still restricted to living only in water, I saw this life split into two distinct forms. One from the one we call plants lived in or inorganic matter and turned these elements into food by utilizing carbon dioxide from the early atmosphere. As a byproduct, plants released free oxygen into the world for the first time. Plant life spread quickly through the oceans and finally onto the land as well.
So
The other form,
he's basically talking about the how evolution took place.
the other form, what we call animals, absorbed only organic life to sustain their vibration. As I watched, the animals filled the oceans in the great ages of fishes, and when the plants had released enough oxygen into the atmosphere, began their own trek towards land. I saw the amphibians, half fish, half something new, leave the water for the first time and use lungs to breathe the new air. Then matter leaped forward again into reptiles and covered the earth in the great period of the dinosaurs. Then the warm blooded mammals came and likewise covered the earth, and I realized that each emerging species represented life, matter, moving into its next higher vibration. Finally, the progression ended. There, at the pinnacle, stood humankind.
So again, one thing led to the
Human, Humankind, the vision ended. I had seen in one flash the entire story of evolution, the story of matter coming into being and then evolving, as if under some guiding plan, towards ever higher vibrations, creating the exact conditions, finally, for humans to emerge, for each of us as individuals to emerge. As I sat there on that mountain, I could almost grasp how this evolution was extended even further in the lives of human beings. Further evolution was related somehow to the experience of life, coincidences. Something about these events led us forward in our lives and created a higher vibration that pushed evolution ahead as well. Yet, as hard as I tried, I couldn't quite understand. For a long time, I sat on the rock precipice, consumed by peace and completeness. Then abruptly, I became aware that the sun was beginning to sink in the west. I also noticed that towards the northwest, about a mile, was a town of some kind. I could make out the shapes of rooftops. The road on the west ridge seemed to meander right to it. I got up and began to climb down the rocks. I laughed out loud. I was still connected with the landscape so that I felt I was walking alongside my own body, and more, that I was exploring the regions of my own body. The feeling was exhilarating. I made my way down the bluffs and into the trees. The afternoon sun cast long shadows along the forest floor. Halfway down, I came to a particularly thick area of large trees, and as I entered, I experienced a perceptible change in my body. I felt even lighter and more coordinated. I stopped and looked closely at the trees and underlying bushes, focusing on their shape and beauty. I could see flickers of white light and what seemed like a pinkish glow around each plant.
So again, now he's
I
observing
continued
the
to
energy. He's observing the energy fields. Okay, ये paragraph कर लो.
I continued to walk, coming to a stream that radiated a pale blue and filled me with an enhanced tranquility and even a drowsiness. Eventually, made my way across the valley floor and up the next ridge until I came to the road. I pulled myself up to the gravel surface and walked casually along the shoulder towards the north.
Okay, I think we can stop here.
Should we stop here?
Yeah. So this is a page. So basically, this was a description